And we're live. Episode 1, part 2 of 20 questions. Hope you all are excited. 2 weeks ago we had Zahir and Dani. And this time we also have Zahir and Dani. Just the script is flipped. Last week, Zahir has Dani questions. Sorry, Dani has Zahir questions. Tonight, Zahir will be asking Dani questions. The idea here is to learn more about each other's narratives, aid in the reconciliation process. Before we get started, a quick shout out to our Patreon visionary members. We have Trivium Energy Pty Ltd. That's an awesome green energy company in Australia. Then we have SOG Cannabis, an awesome green company in California, and Max Marine. If you want to be a Patreon visionary member, link in bio. Not in bio, that's an Instagram term. Link in description. Check it out. We're going to do an after party. So after this, join the Discord. We're going to continue the conversation. If you have questions that don't get answered in this session, you can come to the Discord, ask Dani or Zahir questions, engage in dialogue. That's what we're here to do. And yeah, if you're new to the channel, subscribe, like. We love you. Without further ado, Dani and Zahir, it's great to have you. I'm going to be signing out, but I'm looking forward to this one.
Thank you for having us.
Hey, part 2. So, in a similar vein to the last video, I'm not going to be really sharing my opinion necessarily on all of these questions. So there'll be places, where I might strongly disagree with what Dani has to say. But the point is to hear the perspective on the kind of questions that Palestinians often ask, and get an idea of what either Dani or many other Israelis think about a lot of these questions and these issues and what their narrative is.
I'm Dani. I am the Israeli side of this conflict. I really want the audience to know that as an Israeli, I tried my best to gather information from different sectors within the Israeli society. And so my answer will be that of the Israeli narrative and the different ones. The point is to show that they're not necessarily monolithic. And then I will state my own opinions and my own answers in the end.
Sounds good. The very first question, sort of an easy one, I guess, or one that's really more, entirely about your narrative, which is what is the Jewish identity, and specifically, what is the Jewish connection to the land?
Great first question. So basically, I see Judaism as this kind of meta identity. It's created by very distinct and different aspects that together create the Jewish identity and narrative. And so not everyone thinks that Judaism is just a religion, which is true. It is a religion, and it started as a religion of the people who followed Judaism, but it became so much more than that. So Judaism is a religion that dates back to before, thousands and thousands of years. Abraham, as we know, went from Mesopotamia to the land of Canaan, and there was the birth of the kingdom of Israel, Judea, and the Jewish people. The kingdom of Israel was in the north of modern-day Palestine, and the kingdom of Judea was more or less in the south. We first emerged around the second millennia BC. In the Torah, it says that there was already united Israeli monarchy by the 10th century BCE. Israel was conquered, or the land of Israel, Palestine, was conquered time after time again. So we start with the Greek and the Romans and the Byzantines, and we have the Arab and Muslim conquest. We also have the Crusades. And through each and every one of these conquests, the Jews were exiled. And through that exile, we started living in the diaspora. So you see Jews in the beginning, we moved to the Middle East. So it was Yemen and it was Iraq. And then we spread further to all different lands and all different nations. throughout it all, we always tried to return to the land. Okay, that was our number one mission, to come back to our native homeland. And unfortunately, that was something that was not possible back then, again, because of different conquests and wars. We were permanently exiled after the Jewish-Roman War in 66 to 136 CE. And through our experience in the diaspora, it became not just a religion and not just a history of parish and war, but also an ethnicity, something that united Jews from all over the world. So a Jew in Yemen and a Jew in Andalus was still a Jew before he was Andalusian or before he was Iraqi. We have a common ancestry. We have a common culture. We have things that, again, no matter where Jews are in this world, we unite, whether it's traditions or holidays or our brachot, which is our prayers, and everything connected to coming back home one day to our homeland. And so you see in weddings or in our prayers, we keep saying, Chadash Yemenu Kodem, to renew our prior days, which is basically the days of Jewish rule in the land of Israel, Palestine. Shana Ba Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. Shelo nishkach et Yerushalayim, that we shall never forget Jerusalem. These were things and sayings that were embedded in our culture, our yearn to one day return to the land. So in that sense, I would feel like our connection today, then to the land, is very much like the connection Palestinians today have to this land, this yearn, this passion, this drive to come back to your homes, right? So today you can still see Palestinian homes and you can still see Palestinian buildings. And today you can also still see very ancient Jewish buildings. So like the first and like the most, popular or the most famous is the Western Wall. And that in itself is a mind-boggling experience, because you go to Jerusalem, you see this wall, and it's something that just, and I'm not religious, I'm secular, but it takes over you. It's like you see something that's been standing for millennia, and it's kind of like this wall didn't give up when it was conquered time after time again. It didn't give up when we left in the diaspora. Yes, we did maintain physical presence, although it was a minority in the land throughout the years, but you just see something standing and strong. And this is a reminder of where I came from, where Jews came from. And it kind of gives me strength just to see that thing. So when we look about it, we also have, similar, we have a Semitic language, right? And all these things just tie us together, whether it's monuments, whether it's the language, whether it's the culture, whether it's the ethnicity, right? So I would consider Judaism to be an ethno-religion, but it's just more than that. It's a culture. You can sense out a Jew, and it's not just because of the nose or, God forbid, my horns or my tail. It's just something that is so distinct and so unique to Judaism that you're like, this is a Jew. And so in a nutshell, that to me is Jewish identity. That is my connection to the land, that all these things together, whether it's our ethnicity or our language or our culture, it all ties us to the land of Israel, Palestine.
To get you to expand on just the connection to the land aspect as well, is that view monolithic? So, you have the Mizrahim lived in Syria and Iraq for thousands of years, and you today you see
our yearn to return to the land.
Yeah, like how much of it is would you say that's something that's shared by most Jewish people, or most people who live in the land, maybe live in the land today, like Israeli Jews, or the Jewish diaspora, depending on where they've been around the world and throughout history, and then also even today, just amongst different groups. So, do you feel that when you talk about the land and trying to separate that sort of also from the state,
Yeah.
or a sense of home or belonging. Um, the way traditional nationalists, might feel about the land versus someone who's secular, or the way, the Mizrahim would have felt about the land back when they were still
Yeah.
living in Iraq or Syria.
So I'm going to be really dugri. I can say every single Jew, dreamed of coming back to the land. It's not true. It was a yearn and this longing that was embedded in our culture. This is true. I've already told you, Zahir. So my dad's family comes from Iraq, and they moved here after the establishment of the Jewish state and after the Farhud. My great grandmother was a very proud Iraqi, very proud. She did not want to leave. My family had been in Iraq probably since the exile because they really don't know where they came from other than that. And when she came to Israel, when my family came, my family fled from Israel. So basically, what had happened was that the maid for my family's home came running one day to my family's home and told them, listen, they're on their way. You have to leave now. Everything. Just take whatever you can on you and leave. And so they left. They left their fortune. They left everything behind. They ran. As they left, they realized that they forgot a certain paperwork or document. I really don't know what it was, so I don't want you guys to catch me by the tongue. But they came back, and the maid had been killed for helping my family escape. When they came to Israel, they came from being one of the richest people in Iraq to the most poorest. And my great grandmother felt no connection or little connection to the land of Israel. With my grandparents and his siblings, it was different. They were ardent Zionists. They were like, yes, we're going to come back to the land. With my great grandparents, not so much. And my great grandmother died very quickly from depression, from her inability to be home. So no, I can't say it's monolithic. There were a lot of people. The Jews of Yemen have one of the most, ancient ties to Yemen. And they were very, very proud to be in that land, and they prospered for the most part. So with the Mizrahi, I think that what drove them to the Israeli state is twofold. There were those who said, wow, we finally have a state, so let's go back because this is our state, the state of the Jews. And there were those that said, I'm doing pretty fine here. I live well, I'm well off, and there's no reason for me to get up and leave and start over anew, even if it's my ancestral homeland, right? Because the question is, how long can people stay in the land or be apart from the land to feel that connection? So with my grandfather's family, they've been in Iraq since when they could ever remember. So for them, that's all they knew. With my grandmother's family, that wasn't the case. My grandmother came from Italy, and they were Holocaust survivors. And they, after the Holocaust, came to Israel, to flee persecution. Like, they survived, and they're like, after that, they just realized that there's really no place for them. And so they came here. So no, it's not monolithic. And seculars and religious people do have a connection to the land. And for each, it's different. So for a religious person, it would be because of the Torah, right? Our religion is literally embedded and was created in the land of Israel, Palestine. And the secularists looked at it as, we are trying to assimilate in the lands of, where we were in the diaspora. And we've realized that we are not accepted, right? So in Europe, there was, blatant anti-Semitism, and then they moved more east, and even then there was pogromim, and then the Holocaust. So in Europe, it was just all kinds of effed up, because I don't want to curse. And these people realized that they will never be truly accepted as a civilian of those states. And so for them, it wasn't so much religion necessarily, more than the fact that they realized they had nowhere to go. And then there are those traditional nationalists, like you said, that lived in the land. So my husband, his family has been in Israel for the last 12 generations, at least. So no, it's not monolithic. I can say personally for myself, I was born in Israel and I moved to the States. And when we decided to come back, we came back because we didn't feel America was our home. We didn't feel American. And it wasn't because we weren't, it was because others othered us. They're like, oh, so where are you from really? Oh, you don't look American. Oh, you don't speak like an American. Oh my God, like la 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 la. And so you're just like, okay, how much can a person live in a land that they don't feel, and then they feel their surroundings don't really accept them as part of their own. And we knew that in Israel we wouldn't be othered, and so we came back. We tried it out there, and then even if it was a better life, my parents made more money, we had a home instead of an apartment, so we left a better life to come to Israel so we could feel at home. That was more important to us.
I think you answered that question well, very well. The second question, sort of on a building on everything you just said, how do Israelis view the Palestinian narrative? Our identity, our history in the land, our connection to the land, as well as our struggle today.
So I would divide the Israeli population into 3 categories. I'll call them the deniers, the uneducated, and the sympathizers. Okay? So if we were to start with the deniers, I think deniers is pretty self-explanatory, right? They are people who don't even believe that there is such thing as a Palestinian people or nation because you were never a state proper. So you guys were just Arabs, okay? And this is agav. Agav means, by the way, in Hebrew. It's not exclusive to any spectrum on the political, any party in the political spectrum, meaning there are leftists that deny the existence of the Palestinian people, and there are right-wingers who deny the existence of a Palestinian people and call Palestinians Arabs, okay? So in this context, there's nothing to talk about, unfortunately. There are no Palestinian people. The struggle today is a struggle against Jewish rule, not against Jewish occupation or Israeli occupation. I'd like to, yeah. And it's just kind of like, you guys are just bitter. You guys are salty because the Jews came here to their ancestral homeland, and you're like, we're not going to be ruled by a Jew. So all the Arab nations in the world came, and they were just not really all the Arab nations in the world. I'm exaggerating, but just for the sake of this narrative. So all these Arab nations come and say, we're not having it. We're not going to allow Israel to be a state because it's Jewish. And you guys lost, and now you're salty. Why don't you guys go back to your Arab brethren, right? There was, and pan-Arabism really strengthened that narrative with the deniers, kind of like, okay, you guys are talking about pan-Arabism, and yet you guys aren't accepting the Palestinians. They remain refugees. And so they're just like, if Arabs won't accept Palestinians, why should Jews accept Palestinians?
Can you clarify what you mean by deny the existence of the Palestinian people?
You guys aren't a people. You guys are Arabs. You guys aren't Palestinian. There's no such thing in this narrative. There is no such thing.
How common do you think that view is in society?
I think it's pretty popular. I don't think it's the majority, but I think it's an overwhelming minority. I would say the majority are the uneducated, and I'll get to that after. But yeah, so if we were to call the deniers, I think the deniers are a significant minority, but they're also a significant minority that's dwindling down. So what does it mean by dwindling down? It means that even if they see Palestinians as Arabs, they can still they start accepting the fact that the Palestinian people are calling themselves Palestinians. These people, again, dwindling down, these people are more and more seeing that people don't have to be called a word, okay? So like I call myself Israeli, right? And you call yourself Palestinian. So we don't have to have this title proper. but you guys call yourself Palestinians, and therefore you guys are Palestinians. But when referring to the conflict, the deniers will call it the Arab-Israeli conflict and not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And categorizing as that has also become minute. People, even hardliners and deniers today, are starting to call it the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, even if they don't believe in a Palestinian people. So that's one sector. The other one is the uneducated. Basically, they don't care. They don't care. You know, they're just like, okay, these people did live in the land. They know only what they hear from the media. So we hear from the media that there were people who lived in this land. They don't know for how many years, right? And that also has to do with the fact that a lot of Palestinians are trying to connect themselves from different places, and people don't understand that the Palestinian nationality is created from different influxes, from different regions. But nonetheless, they've stayed here long enough to become this unified nation, right? These people that had this connection to the land. So they know there is a connection, but they don't know what the connection is. They don't know how long you've been here. They don't know, they're just like, yeah, they call themselves Palestinians because this was mandatory Palestine and they were the people of the land. And that's pretty much it. The uneducated are mostly ambivalent to the conflict. So it's not that they support the occupation, but they kind of see it as kind of your problem, okay? Because what Israelis see in media is that the Palestinians are responsible for their struggle today, their inability to govern themselves, or their praise for terror. All those different kind of like, in Hebrew you say sismaot, but it doesn't translate well to English. So kind of like mottos or logos that you see on the news, the headlines, that's basically what they repeat. But if you ask them anything, they don't really know anything. And so I think they're actually the majority of Israel. Majority of Israelis don't know much of the conflict rather than there was a conflict. So basically this is what they know. There are people in this land. Okay, Zionists come to the land of Israel, Palestine, and want to establish a state. The Palestinians weren't going to have it. And so, and then the British, with the Peel Commission and the partition plan and all that stuff, Israel accepted, the Palestinians rejected. There was a war. As consequence of the war, you guys were exiled. Actually, most Israelis believe that you guys left by free will, meaning that your leaders, Palestinian or Arab leaders, encouraged Palestinians to leave their homes because they promised them that they would defeat the Jewish enemy, and by the time we were defeated, Palestinians could return. And so when you ask an uneducated Israeli on the topic, they'll say, but Palestinians left on their own free will. Like, I don't get it. Okay. And they're in large unknowledgeable about the Nakba. So if the deniers deny it, the ambivalents just don't know about it. Okay. The uneducated. They'll just go like, what's a Nakba? And then we go to the pragmatic or the sympathizers. Hold up. Yeah. So I kind of divided the sympathizers into two groups. The pragmatic sympathizers, and that's the one that I identified myself with, and the radical sympathizers. So we can start with the pragmatic. So the pragmatic sympathizers basically have educated themselves on Palestinian narrative and history, okay, or at least attempt to. They want to understand what the connection Palestinians have to the land, what consists of the Palestinian people, because we talk about Arabs, but you, Zahir, know more than anyone that Palestinians are not just Arabs. We have different ethnicities that comprise the Palestinian nationality. Is that correct for me to say, by the way, ethnicities?
Sure. I mean, tribes, ethnicities. I think
Yeah.
like largely it's a Arab meta ethnicity with like other groups like the Armenians and but for the most part, it's like an Arab meta-ethnicity, you know, with a lot of like Mustarab, Arabized peoples, and then you have a lot of old tribes and clans that kind of make up this like confederation that is the Palestinian identity.
So it's very much similar to the Jewish identity, because you have Jewish Iraqis and Jewish, French, and you have Jewish Moroccans, and you have Jewish Americans. So you have Jews kind of like, that came at an influx. And so maybe not as diverse, but at the same time, you can find, I think, a correlation between the two, this kind of meta identity, meta ethnicity that is common to both Jews and Palestinians. I was asked, which sector am I in? So I'm in the pragmatic sympathizers, which is I'm the one explaining now. So you really try to educate yourself on the history and the narrative. The pragmatic sympathizers understand that the Palestinians have had a connection to the land. The pragmatic sympathizers understand that Zionism had responsibility over the situation today. The pragmatic sympathizers understand that the responsibility Israel has over the Nakba and the Naksa and the occupation. Okay? What makes us pragmatic is that we don't let our sympathy or our empathy lead us into radical sympathizers, and that's what I'm going to get into, and say, no, I deserve a state because I have nowhere else to go. Nowhere. No one will take me in as their own. So I need to live here. It doesn't even matter if it's justified or not. It's a necessity that, Jews have a land that they're safe in. But it is also a necessity that the Palestinians have a land of their own. And so the pragmatic sympathizers, whether it's a federation or a one-state solution or a two-state solution, that's already, but they believe that there needs to be a solution, and they understand that Israel has the responsibility to find a solution. Okay? So we are sympathetic to the struggle. However, we will not disintegrate our state or a state that Jews can be safe in for Palestinian livelihood. So that's what kind of makes us pragmatic, if that makes sense. Just a second. So that's basically what makes us pragmatic. So in a nutshell, pragmatic sympathizers, we are willing to learn the narrative, understand the history, understand the struggle, accept a responsibility over the Palestinian situation today, and understand that we have a responsibility to find a solution to this conflict. Okay? Just not the expense of our livelihood. So it doesn't mean that two people can't live here equally and with the same rights. It just means that I will not leave back to Iraq or Italy or the States or Argentina. This land is my land. Then we have the radical sympathizers, which are a very small minute of the Israeli population. And those are the people who you would say like anti-Zionists. So people who say Israel has no justification in its creation and in being here. And this land, even if it was our ancestral homeland, I think Ariel Gold, if her name is right, so she said she was indigenous to Spain, even though that's where we were in the diaspora, but sure. So she would be considered as a radical sympathizer. So she's like, I'm indigenous to Spain. I have no historical ties to Israel. And this needs to be Palestine. I don't know specifically if that's her, but that's the narrative. Palestinians should be given back this land. And that is not something that I identify with. I identify the right for two peoples to live in this land as equals. I don't believe it needs to come in my expense. So that's what divides me between a pragmatic into a radical. I really hope that was in a nutshell. Also, forgot to say, because of genetic papers that are being written and published, more and more people, for example, the uneducated, are able to have sources and have access to these sources that really show the tie of Jews and Palestinians to the land. And these articles show that we are cousins, that we have more genetic in common, we as in the Israelis and the Palestinians, the people who lived in this land, more than we do anyone else or with any other place. And so that's really interesting. And so when you see these genetic studies, it kind of breaks down a barrier from what divides us. And while it could be looked at as a threat, it is my hope, I actually don't know, but it is my hope that it would create a bigger and a larger understanding and more legitimacy on Israel's end to the Palestinian narrative in connection to the land.
I guess expanding on that, you sort of touched on like a lot of the different views that exist inside the society. And Palestinians have a sense that Israelis and Israeli Jews expect a sort of they sort of expect an acknowledgement and an awareness of both Jewish history and their history in the land, and why in order to understand like why they're here and why they feel a connection to it. But on the flip side, I find that there's almost no awareness of Palestinian history. There's a constant desire to
Erase it.
Erase, reduce, equate Palestinian history in the land with, say, the rise of Palestinian nationalism, or say, oh, these people have been here for a few hundred years. And there's no awareness of the history of the tribes that have been here. There's no awareness of how long the different groups and what their culture is. There's a desire to lump all these different clans and tribes into a larger pan-Arabist bubble. There's no awareness of the Nakba or the Naksa, or even just what people live through today. And so I guess a lot of it can fall into kind of like what you described as the denier, and the also just the uneducated bubble.
Can I just there was a question asked, and it reminded me that I did leave a sector out of the people, what they feel about this land. So the question, if I may, is, are there Israelis who believe that they should leave this land and give it back to Palestinians? We talked about the radicals. So they asked if there are Jews inside the land who believe that. So the radicals don't necessarily believe in Israel that we should give it back to the Palestinians. There are a radical Hasidic or ultra-Orthodox group that don't believe Israel should have been created because the Messiah hasn't come. So yeah, that is one of the minute groups within Israel, and why they feel that Israel shouldn't exist. It's for religious reasons, even though, disclaimer, the Torah doesn't say anything about Jews having to come back to their ancestral homeland only when the Messiah comes. So back to your question. If I may, I would like to explain, one, why Jews feel the need always to advocate for their narrative. And then I would like to answer basically why Israelis at large do not acknowledge or are unaware of the Palestinian narrative, or disinterested in learning about the Palestinian narrative. So first, I would like to talk about the reason why Israelis feel the need always to defend themselves and their legitimacy. So I can talk on and on about persecution. I can talk on and on about the fact that, we were never really accepted especially into the West, not necessarily in the Middle East, by the way, but, when we came to Israel and established the state, we felt that there was this new wave of anti-Semitism that was labeled anti-Zionism. So whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic or not is very difficult to answer because of how many different takes there are on the word Zionism and on the word anti-Semitism. So for me and for many, and I think this is how it's also defined in the dictionary, Zionism is the self-determination of the Jewish people. Okay, that in itself as a sentence is fine. Palestinians see Zionism as the reason for the Nakba and the Naksa. So the Nakba is 48 when there was about 500,000 Palestinians, if not more, left the state of Israel, the land of Israel, Palestine, during as a consequence of not only war but Israel's attempt to demographically reverse the population in the land. And then the Naksa was the subsequent of 1967. So we continue. There is another war. We are occupying more land, and that is the Naksa. And so I can understand why Palestinians see Zionism as something inherently evil. I get it. But to Jews, it's not inherently evil. It's an idea that Jews should self-determine in their ancestral homeland. Okay? And so when we see people who are anti-Zionists, we see people who are against the idea of the Jewish people to self-determine in their ancestral homeland, to rip the Jews away from the only home they ever really had, the only place they would never be othered for being a Jew, the only place in the world where they wouldn't be persecuted for being a Jew. And so we need to combat this by advocating our narrative, our history, our connection, justifying the fact that we weren't just European colonizers who woke up one day and saw this land and we're just like, hey, we're just going to take it from all these Arabs. Like, you know, that wasn't the case. I mean, that's maybe how Palestinians saw it happen, but that wasn't our case. Okay.
Well, I think you're kind of touching on a later question, which is sort of how we feel about like the ethno-nationalism in general and how that ties into Zionism, how, like, why Palestinians have a problem with it as an ideology, but more along like there's a politicization of the history that sort of doesn't need to happen. So like you'll see leaders on both sides do this, where there's a desire to like pretend, like just thinking as an academic, like I think like the history of people in the land is like for anthropology and genetics and you know, science, as well as an understanding of people's, you know, narrative tales and whatnot to answer. And when you understand it, you get this big picture. So, you know, you have the, like, you know, 12 tribes of Israel, of Jacob, you have the sons of Ishmael and sort of the Arab, you know, Adnanite, Qahtanite founding myth. And then we look at anthropology and we look at sort of the research, archaeology and whatnot, and we form a picture of like where these people formed, what their history is. And I think it's I guess it seems to me that acknowledgement of Palestinian history is for a lot of people, with the exception of really academics, for most, you know, for the broader population, almost seems as a threat. Yeah,
it is, and it really coincides with the reason why we advocate. The international arena, the way it works, the way we think is in a zero-sum game terms, okay? So if the Palestinians are equally indigenous, and I say indigenous just because you and I talked about it, we don't really like the word, but just, you know, because it's a popular term, I'm using it. If we are both indigenous to the land, that means you have just as much right to this land as the Jews. That is seen as a threat because we are a state for the Jews. And so there is no reason to learn about the history of the people we went to war with and won against. So it's kind of like when you think of the history of Israel, this is what Israelis learn. Obviously, we already went through all the, you know, conquests and the Jews going to the diaspora and then the second table and then another diaspora, blah, 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 blah. Okay, I don't want to get into it because we already did. Then we learn that it was under Ottoman control. And then after Ottoman control, it was under British control. And then we fought against the Brits and then we got the land. And then we fought against the Arabs and then we got the land. That's it. C'est tout. Nigmar sipur. Okay, done. And so, yeah, it was actually really interesting because there were a couple of articles that I read, albeit from extreme left wings, but they started talking about how the Ministry of Education doesn't teach about the history, not necessarily of the Palestinians, but even, you know, like, where'd you guys come from and what, you know, but even the fact that you guys were here, that you guys were legitimate people of the land that were taken away from it. And yeah, it's seen as a threat because it threatens the status quo. What happens the second we acknowledge, as a state, I'm talking about as a state, not as an individual, the second the state acknowledges that Palestinians have a right to this land and they have a history to this land, we would have to act, right? So in any historical event, when you acknowledge something, you have to act on it. That's why Turkey, for example, doesn't acknowledge the Armenian genocide, because it would have grave consequences. And these are consequences that the Israeli government is not ready or is not willing to face. I don't see it. I don't see it as a threat. I mean, I did in the beginning. I won't lie. I was very hesitant to learn about the Palestinian history. I was resistant. Every time I learned something about the Palestinian history, my aim when I started learning the Palestinian history was to debunk its legitimacy. Straight up, I'm going to be a chidugri. I wanted to debunk it. I wanted to show the people that Palestinians don't have this history or this narrative that they claim. And then I learned, and then I realized that I can't debunk anything because it is what it is. And it was really hard for me to accept, really hard, especially because I am a wholehearted Zionist. And I know Zionist to you is a bad word, but to me, it's not a bad word. It doesn't mean the expulsion of the Palestinians to me. It means living in my homeland. Okay? And how could I be a Zionist and then accept the Palestinian narrative? It was difficult. It was very difficult. And it was a process that I went through. And it was a bunch of emotions that I had to go through. And when you realize that these people are just as connected, and if not more, to this land than I am, okay? That they have this yearn, that they have, you know, you can go to Akka and you can go to Jerusalem and you can go to all these places and you see that it was built by Palestinians. It was built by Palestinians. And then you're just like, okay, so what do I do with this now? And this is exactly why I'm on this great debate. You know, well, we're not on the great debate, we're on the 20 questions, but you know what I mean? This is how I got to the server. This was after trying to understand the Palestinian narrative and then understanding that it is valid. And now that it's valid, what do I do? What do I do? I need to find not me specifically, but Israel needs to find a solution for this occupation, because people who have an attachment to, no people should be occupied, but especially not people who had such a connection to the land. And yes, a lot of people can justify it by, well, we were at war and you guys lost, your problem. But it's our problem because we've been occupying you. We've been allowing. Yeah.
So this like on these sort of this understanding of the history, I think, and this will kind of tie into all the other questions, and I think I'll try to move through them a little bit faster. But
yeah.
A question that Palestinians often ask is in regards to Aliyah. So and this links directly to this sort of like connection to the land. When this idea that why does a Jew who, you know, is born in America or converts to the religion have the right to make Aliyah? And then, you know, a friend of mine's sort of grandfather, who, you know, was there for 1,000 years, like 2,000 years, and many generations after, who built so many of the structures that are there in the land today, doesn't have the right to return, doesn't have the right to basically come back to the land. So on the one hand, you're asking people to accept that Jewish people have a connection to this land, it's their homeland, so they have a right to come back. But on the other hand, you know, this other group of people has this connection to the land, doesn't. And Aliyah, particularly, you know, is one of those things that doesn't sit well with people, especially with a situation that, you know, the way it is now. I don't know. in the sense that, why do Jews have the right to make Aliyah, but not the exiled Palestinians?
So Jews have a right to this land. As like I said, it is an ethno-religion, right? So if you convert, you don't just convert to the religion. You convert to this meta identity, okay? You accept the Jewish religion, narrative, culture, history, and language as your own, okay? And the notion of the establishment of the Jewish state was that every Jew has the right to come back to their ancestral home because of history of persecution. So that's why Jews have the right. Now I'm going to give you an answer that's not very nice at all, but it's the truth. Jews have a state, Palestinians don't. And Palestinians, for the most, are not part of the Israeli society. We have the Israeli Palestinians, and Nahon, they don't have that right, again, because it's a Jewish state. So I don't think it has to do with who has a right specifically, because if we ask who has a right, as an individual, I say Palestinians should have the same rights as Jews, especially because Palestinians today are not integrated and are not accepted in other places. I can't compare it to the Jewish Holocaust, what you guys are going through in the diaspora, but I can agree that it's, not a good place to be in. To feel like you are not accepted there, and nor do you want to be accepted, which I understand. It's just like a Jew doesn't, even if he assimilates, he'll always carry that identity as a Jew. And that's not, again, a religion. It's so much more than that, just like Palestinian is so much more than just, the land. It's become, a huge narrative, a struggle, a yearn. So I believe that both should have the right of return. However, if we look at it in a completely Machiavellian point of view, we have a state, and it's a state for a Jewish nation, and Palestinians don't. And so it's not whether you have a right, you don't have the ability to, in a nutshell.
I guess this sort of ties back to your question earlier. So most ethnic or religious states or ethno-religious states, whether it's sort of like Iran or China or Turkey, have a history of committing atrocities, ethnic cleansing, or effectively needing to exercise some kind of military or totalitarian rule over the part of their population that isn't that ethno-religious identity that the state is all about, in order to maintain this ethnic or religious demographic control of the state. We see this in with sort of the Han Chinese in China. We see this in Iran. We see this in Turkey. In general, building this, you get ethno states that are sort of born out of history, where just like it happens to be the case that most of the people there are one ethnicity. But whenever that turns into a form of nationalism, historically, that's always been a terrible thing. When you start to define the most important value of the state as basically being, a place and a nationalism just for one ethnic group or one ethno-religious group, or even one ethno-religious group first, with either minority second. And this tends to be where Palestinians sort of constantly complain or object to Zionism. So it's not so much the returning to the land part, or having your own state. It's the fact that you're going to a land with multiple ethnic groups and multiple religious groups, and then you're establishing a state just for that group of people. Whether it's sort of having more or less equal rights, but ultimately no, a nationalism that centers around one group of people, like with the Jewish nation state law for Israeli Arabs, or the fact that the borders of the land which you sort of effectively control or exercise sovereignty over, half that population is Palestinian, half that population is a different ethnic group, a different ethno-religious group. And the only way to kind of prevent those people from exercising their rights, or establish a demographic majority in an area where you simply weren't a demographic majority, was to expel a population. And so to us, this sort of like the ethnic cleansing or military or totalitarian rule, generally controlling the lives or having a different system for different ethnicities based on a different system based on your ethnicity just comes part and parcel with an ideology of an ethno-religious state. And that is why Palestinians struggle with basically, and I don't think we're ever going to, not struggle with almost every form of Zionism, with some exceptions. I mean, you can get some definitions that are like, very loose, one might even call radical, or very much, and that may be what most people care about, like what you said yourself, like just, okay, well, I live here, I'm from here. But whenever it manifests as a nationalism, I think people take issue with that. And the question is effectively just like, how do you justify the existence of an ethno-religious state
today
in Israel? Even today.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sababa. So if we're going to talk about it today, in general, Israelis see it as this. There's a misunderstanding on what a Jewish state is. It's not necessarily a religious state, and those religious components that do rule over the state, believe me, they are not popular amongst many of the Israelis. And so for us, a Jewish state is kind of like, just like America is a state for Americans, and England is for English, and France is for France.
That's the Israeli identity. Like the Israeli identity includes Bedouins or Israeli Arabs or Druzim or whatever. The Jewish identity is ethno-religious. Someone can convert to Judaism. That's a religious conversion. The rabbinical authority has to decide that he's a halachic Jew, and then he can kind of migrate there, or have one Jewish
not even
ethnic
halachic Jew. Yeah, it's not even yeah. Also, Israelis, and what we understand is that even though this is a state for the Jewish people, Christians and Muslims within Israel have the same rights as Jews. So you have Muslims who are in the Supreme Court. You have Christians who are able to exercise their religion freely and take part in society and in parliament. They can all go to the same universities. If anything, the Arab population, the Palestinian population, they have, you call it positive affirmation in English?
Affirmative action.
Affirmative action, thank you. And so we are like, okay, fine, this is a Jewish state, but this is a Jewish state where other minorities can live as equals, okay? Their rights aren't, they don't have any less right than a Jew besides Aliyah. Pretty much it. That is the only thing that is different between a Jew and a Muslim and a Christian within the state of Israel. Obviously,
but isn't that just about drawing your map, right? Like you can, that works today because of this armistice line paradigm. You can just draw your lines such that you took in few enough Arabs that the state cannot be an apartheid, basically few enough that they're just 20% of the population, and then you specifically exclude the regions where everyone kind of was forced to. Most people in Gaza are not from Gaza. That like most people were pushed out from other areas during the Nakba, the Naksa, and most people in the West Bank are not from the West Bank. So it seems to just be inextricably a part of the ideology. Like if you believe it is important for it to be an ethnic state, despite the fact that there are two ethnicities, or at least two meta ethnicities and a bunch of other ethnicities in the land, then you have sort of no choice but to I mean, the word transfer was used. You have to move a population out. You have to put them in another area, otherwise you just simply can't have that. Have that state.
Like,
and
I think the
just
question
would add
that every
one
Israel
more
has,
thing. With regards to having equal rights. I think having equal rights is one thing, but a nationalism for one ethnicity is another. So I think if you had a large minority inside of America, and then the majority, say like white people, where it was the white nation state or the Caucasian nation state, or the I don't know what the ethnicity you'd call it is, Anglo-American nation state, but with equal rights for other groups, people would take issue to that. This is the nation state law. I know not everyone agrees with the nation state law, but there's a sense that like it's not enough.
So you're right. Not everyone agrees with the nation state law. A lot of people. Maybe it's also my circle because I'm secular and liberal. So it could be that I'm also completely biased to the people around me. But the people around me were just kind of like WTF, like why put in this national law? But that's besides the point. Right. You have people from all over the world and different ethnicities living in America, and yet all of them wave the American flag. And this has to do a lot about what is the Israeli identity today. Israel was established for the Jews, right? It was the Jewish people who came home to their ancestral homeland. Our flag is the symbol of the Jewish people, of the Jewish nation. Our national anthem depicts the longing you had to come to Israel, right? So I think the first time I heard the Israeli national anthem that I could actually remember, it was a video clip of Holocaust survivors on a ship coming into Israel and singing it. And I remember crying my eyes out, like, because you're just thinking, look at what these people went through. And sorry, I get really emotional when I talk about it. Look at what these people went through, and they're singing with such passion and such hope to come to this land. And then you're just like, okay, but Israel doesn't have only Jews. She has Christians and she has Muslims. And what is this meta-ethnicity, this meta-nationality? What does it represent? What does it mean when we're no longer a Jewish state? Do we stop singing, the songs of our ancestors? Do we stop waving the flag of our people? What does it mean? And so these questions you have to understand. And I'm telling it to you, Zahir, and to our audience, it has such grave consequences on our narrative and our identity. And what do we do from now? Can a Muslim, can a Palestinian wave the Israeli flag? Let's say we do a one-state binational, state. Could he wave a Jewish flag? And what is it for us to give up on that? And what is it for us to give up our national anthem, that talks about like our yearning? So you think of, if this is no longer a Jewish state, what is it? And it becomes an identity crisis. And it becomes something that you need to let go of. Palestinians don't want to let go of their identity and what comprises them. In your case, Palestinians isn't tied to a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim. And for us, our ethnicity is very much tied to our religion because, it started as a religion. And so what does it mean for us? And so I don't know if there's a way to justify it. If I'm not a Jew, if I'm taking off my Jewish or my Israeli cap and I'm looking at it objectively, but personally, I just don't know how I could give up these symbols for an Israeli proper state and not a Jewish proper state. Yeah.
I guess, do you feel, I'll go on to the next question, which is, do you feel that this state came at the, or do Israelis, for the most part, feel that the state came at the expense of Palestinians? That, so you can, you can sort of, on the one hand, in your narrative, understand why it was so important for Jewish people to form the state. But do you think most Israelis understand, the impact that this had? That are aware of the fact that, like, really instilling this democratic majority kind of required, it had to come at the expense of the people who were there when you arrived, basically.
There are those who don't care. Like, they see it as just a natural consequence of war. So, we went over this narrative earlier, so I'm just going to say it in a sentence. They're like, we were here, they were here. Britain decided to give us the land. They didn't have it. We went to war. We won. They left. And now they're just bitter because they lost. And a lot of Israelis, and this is a very popular view, kind of look at other states and they're like, but other states were created the exact same way. And you told me this, Zahir, when you were just like, yeah, other states were created the same, but you were created at a time where this was no longer acceptable. And so as Jews see it as kind of a double standard, kind of like most other states were established the same way. We don't see the Native Americans, you know, getting independence. We don't see, I don't know, just, you know, Cyprus, for example, which there's a dispute, or, you know, the land between Pakistan and India. We have all these things. We don't see them coming and saying like, oh, but you wipe them away. And it's only towards the Israelis that they say this. It's towards so it's either they don't care because, you know, they see it as a consequence of war. It's either they think it's justified because it was a consequence of war and that's what happens. And, you know, they're just hating on Israel because we were late in the game. And then there's those others that obviously see it. I'm one of those, and I don't think I'm the only one. And I can tell you people who don't really want to give the Palestinians a state. We're like, yeah, we drove them out. You know, we had a mission, and that was to create a Jewish state. And in order to create a Jewish state, we needed a Jewish minority, and, you know, we had to do what needed to get done in order to have the state, especially because before the establishment of the state, Jewish migration to the land was limited by the British, and before that, the Ottomans. And after the Holocaust, we could not uphold these limitations. We're just like, no. And then Ben Gurion was kind of like, just so you know, the establishment of the state was extremely contested between the first government of Israel. It barely passed. We were like, we were not ready. We need more, you know, la la la, and the Brits and the Palestinians or the Arabs, because we didn't call you Palestinians back then. And la la la, and Ben Gurion's like, yo, like we need to get right now 500,000 Jews from Europe. So I really don't care if we are ready or not. We need to do this because Jews who came to the land were sent to Cyprus and into camps. Like, how sensitive of that? Someone leaves Auschwitz or Treblinka, and then they take them to another camp in Cyprus. So even the decision to establish a state was done in a hurry, just because we knew that we needed to absorb a huge influx. And so even then it's kind of justified because of that, but it doesn't mean that people are blind to the consequences of the necessity of the Jewish people back then. Even people who don't like the Palestinians or don't agree that they need a state understand that this was done. So you either sympathize with it and say, okay, what now? Now we need to find a solution. Or you say, like, yeah, it happened, but, you know, tough luck. So I hope that less and less Israelis will say it happened, tough luck. And more Israelis will say, now we need to find a solution. Like, we effed up. We established the state the way that we did, and it had grave consequences on the Palestinian people. Now we have a state. Now we are not in existential fear of persecution. So now we have the luxury, so to speak, to start understanding what we can do for the Palestinians in order for them to have the right to self-determine in this land. I hope that answered your question. I kind of went on a rant.
No, that's okay. I guess as far as sort of there's this like narrative of survival, like necessity, and that's one thing. I think there's another aspect of just like who you really consider part of your in-group. So the people that you think your state is there to protect. You know, so there's a 20% of your population today is Arab, you know, ethnically, and half the population of the land, you know, the borders that we sort of picture when we say Al Palestine or Israelis say Eretz Israel. Do you feel that there is a racism or a xenophobia or a prejudice towards Arabs or Palestinians in Israeli
Yes,
society, both
definitely.
inside your borders and out?
Yeah. Most definitely, either with Israeli Arabs or Palestinian. Again, I feel bad when I say Israeli Arabs because I know it's like Israeli Palestinian, but that's just how we call them. So yeah, there's a huge xenophobia. I think that is actually the most prominent. I don't know many Israelis who see Israeli Arabs or Palestinians. Actually, that's not true. My circle is very different. But in general, the bigger picture, there is this otherness. So, like, even when we identify ourselves as Mizrahi, right? So, like, my family from Iraq is Mizrahi. God forbid I call my father a Jewish Arab. You have to see his reaction. He'll like flip his shit. Like he'll be going like, "What did you call me?" And just like, I don't get what I said. Like you lived with in an Arab land, like you're Jew, and he's just like, "No, I am Mizrahi." And I'm like, okay. So there's this huge othering. So yeah, there's blatant racism. Also, the affirmative action doesn't do much good for the way Israelis see Israeli Arabs, because we see that ultimately they are being favored above us. And so yeah, there's no we. It's me and it's you. There is a minority who sees a lot of affinity with the Arabs, and you'll see that it's usually like the older Mizrahi men that like lived side by side with Palestinians or Arabs. So for them, it's just really like all the same. The only difference is just Jewish state Israel and their but there's not really an othering, if that makes sense. But I could say at large that there is a huge xenophobia. I don't think that there is a kinship that is prominent enough between Israeli and Palestinians to kind of bridge that gap. And that is something I'm hoping this segment can actually help Israelis and Palestinians alike to stop othering each other and realize that we are more alike and we have much more in common than we'd like to think. Yeah.
Well answered. Next question, sort of on a different, different vein than history and narrative. Today, Palestinians who live in the West Bank feel the conflict constantly. So I think it's a day-to-day part of our lives. We effectively live under military rule, and I think this goes for really all areas. Whether you live in Area B or Area C, you have different experiences, but ultimately, your home is raided at night, often just for establishment of presence. There's total control over your economy, your borders, your ability to invest, start a business, your ability to move, just to travel from different areas inside the West Bank. So not to cross into Israel, but just to go from one Arab town in Area A to another Arab town. You have to pass through many checkpoints. You at any there are curfews that can be imposed at any moment. People will stop you, and your soldiers can stop you to ask for your ID. You're effectively under the military rule of a army that isn't your army.
Doesn't serve to protect you.
And you have no accountability with. I mean, if the case happens to be filmed and taken to court or whatever, then there's some recourse. But for vast majority of cases, it's not your army. So it's sort of being policed by military that you don't control. And that's when things are calm, and then when things aren't calm, when there's protests or in the intifadas, then you are in the middle of a conflict zone, and every aspect of your life is controlled. You get curfews imposed, and It's funny that we're living in lockdowns with COVID because we went through that in the second brother, where everyone had to stay inside their homes. You couldn't approach the window or you'd be shot at. So people just had to have like food stored up,
Yeah.
knowing that they wouldn't be allowed to leave. And it feels very much that we are living under the tyranny of a foreign people or another nation. And so and then in Gaza you have the blockade. Israelis talk about having pulled out of Gaza. Gazans feel like, well, economically, in terms of our freedom of movement, our ability to travel, every aspect of our lives is still, our future, our ability to actually build our society is still controlled by another state. And so resistance on the Palestinian side, or violence, feels like a struggle against tyranny. And I think basically the question is, do Israelis feel that the oppression of Palestinians contributes to this cycle of violence? That Israelis will say something like, we need to do this for security, and Palestinians basically saying the reason you have a security concern is because you are trying to control us. Sex semper tyrannis sort of thing.
Yeah. Wow. I think that the majority, and I also see the comments. So the comments from the Israelis, it's my safety before your safety. Or I don't know if they're Israeli, but I'm really assuming. And I think that's what it comes down to. So you're right. Most Israelis see it as we are the way that we are, and we are acting the way that we're acting, or the state is acting the way that it is because of security concerns. So even though the Palestinians were always occupied, well, actually not always, כן ולא, אבל proper occupied def after 67, it wasn't as restrictive as it is today. So the two intifadas, while Palestinians think that the intifada was successful because it got the Israeli state to the table to negotiate, it also created stronger security actions. Okay, so after the second intifada, you have the wall that basically separated between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and it was seen necessary because of how violent the second intifada was. And so it really is a chicken and an egg conundrum. Yes, Israelis can admit that the reason, there is attacks is because they are attacking oppression. At the end of the day, because most Israelis, or not most Israelis, but enough to be constituted either overwhelming minority or anything above that, sees the Palestinians as a greater Arab nation. So you look at other Arab states and you see all the chaos and havoc that's going there. The militant rule, the Islamic leaderships, the Islamic terrorist groups, killing innocent civilians. It's just kind of like we see this pattern that is common to the Middle East, specifically by Islamic Arabs. And we're just like, if it wasn't us, you guys would still be doing these things. So just targeted against us. But had we not been here, you guys would have been like most other Arab and Muslim nations and states.
In what
just
sense?
like
I'm not sure I follow.
Kind of like Afghanistan, like Syria. Okay.
Afghanistan's not. It's not Africa.
Afghanistan's not Middle East. It's Asia. I know, but I'm just because it's Islamic regime. The Taliban is Islamic. That's why I said Islamic and Arabic. And so you have Syria that, there was a civil war going on, and now it's only starting to stabilize. Sorry, the comments distracted me. I'm with you. So you have this Iraq, even though Iraq, a lot of the issues it has today is actually because of U.S. intervention. But again, let's give Israelis the benefit of the doubt and claim that most of them are uneducated on the topic, okay, or ambivalent. They just don't care. But what they do see is, or the Arab uprisings, even though the Arab Spring in 2011 began, or 2012 began as with the goal of creating a democracy in the Middle East. You know, these Islamic regimes thwarted them. I mean, not in everyone, right? Tunisia, for example, is a really great success story. But I don't know how many Israelis have heard about Tunisia. You see also Lebanon, even though Lebanon started out as a Maronite country, but then you just have all this sectarian violence, and then you have Hezbollah. And, you know, so you just see that these kind of terrorist groups, actually, why am I doing this? Hezbollah is for me a terrorist group for everything. And
do you not see that? I mean, you sort of seem to be saying that. Well, your state was probably going to be shit anyways. So it's just shit under us.
You asked me to be dugri, like be.
But I mean, surely you don't think life in Jordan, or with all of the issues that exist there, is as bad as life for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. It's not even close. People in Jordan don't have buildings, you know.
Right, but what did Jordan do to the Palestinians the second they started to constitute a legit threat to the stability of a state in 1970?
Well, I think that was more like a conflict between the leadership. I mean,
but how did Jordan respond?
Well, that is sort of the difference, right? So there is conflict.
You guys are actually part of this land. Nachon, legamre, but I'm telling you how Israelis see it.
No, I mean beyond that. So most people will look back at the history of war and kind of go, okay, this war is always, you know, ugly. And then there's peace, and people sort of, to some extent, move past it, even if they hold grievances afterwards. I think subjugation, or like control by another group, is a different thing entirely. So you can talk about a conflict, or a coup, or a civil war, or an uprising, revolt, a change of leadership, dictatorships, revolution, all these things that happen in the States. I just think like there's a sense that basically Israelis will use the word security to justify anything, and it's just like, yes, if you're a totalitarian, or if you're an oppressive regime, the population that feels they're being oppressed is going to threaten the security of that oppressive regime, of course. And it seems basically to Palestinians that Israelis will say, you know, if you guys just were peaceful, that we, you know, then there'd be peace. But I kind of think of Hassan Kanfani's quote, which is basically something like, you know, you don't mean peace talks, you mean surrender. It's a conversation between the sword and the neck. Like,
even if it was to surrender, it's kind of like accepting that you guys lost. I mean, I know it sounds mean, but I'm just trying to be really honest and explain like how Israeli sees it. Like, you guys lost, and you guys are still coming with demands. It just doesn't add up in our mind. Like, I won the war, and yet you're coming with demands, and I need to fulfill your demands. You guys, you Palestinians, should thank us for whatever we do give you, you know? And anything that happens ultimately on our end is your responsibility, because you are creating this reaction from us. So you said night raids are, you know, at large also to establish just presence, to make Palestinians never forget who's really in charge, right? And then I told you about my husband's experience, that he had only ever went into any place after he got straight up intelligence. There is a terrorist who is hiding in this building, and we need to go into this building. He's in this room, okay? There are like 3 doors that you need to pass until you get to this room where he is. And so that
I guess but it will always come back to this question of so you use the example of like losing a war, and it's just like, well, and if if there was an independent Palestinian state today, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Or that this would be the geopolitics of two neighboring countries, like the geopolitics of Israel and Jordan, or the
Right.
geopolitics of Israel and Egypt. But as far as a people go, people never live under oppression indefinitely. It's never sustainable. You can't. At some point, those people revolt against it. So we don't have independence. We are controlled by a military that is on our own. And so there's a sense that basically you can use security to justify, or Israelis use security to justify anything and everything.
Right.
And so you'll say, if we remove these checkpoints, then you'll protest against us and you'll riot like in the First Intifada. We're
Our
like,
fear
yeah, we will.
isn't you guys are going to protest or riot. Our fear is that you're going to put bombs in buses and bomb hospitals and go to kids and innocent civilians and attack them. Even though it hurts just as bad if an Israeli soldier falls at the hands of Palestinians, the war you've waged has not been directed towards the IDF solely. It's been directed to innocent civilians and even Palestinians who are against Aliyah and looked at Zionists as European colonizers. We've already been 3 generations born in this modern state. And so the person who was born here didn't choose to occupy you, didn't choose to, reversically do demographic reversal and throw you out of the land. He was just born here. That's all he was. He was just born here. And he is a legitimate target to Palestinians. That's how Israelis see it. And so, yes, Shakespeare said all is fair in love and war, but Israel's like, not when it comes to innocent civilians. And so our fears, once we put down the checkpoints, is not that you're going to fight the IDF. That might be the state fear, but I'm talking about the Israeli public, because I'm not up there. I don't know what they think. They could be BSing me when they talk to the Israeli public and explain their reasoning. So I'm just saying how Israelis see it. We're not scared that you're going to fight an IDF soldier, throw a rock at him or a Molotov cocktail. We're not scared that you're going to protest for rights. We're scared that it's going to come back to the Second Intifada and you're going to start blowing shit up and blowing innocent civilians up.
So, I mean, that probably leads me to, the next question, which is there is this, where we talk about the Second Intifada, where basically the tactics changed, and even the second half of the First Intifada. So the First Intifada, you have united leadership, where united leadership of the revolution, which basically had a clear premise of what the First Intifada was supposed to be and what it largely was, which was basically a popular revolt. So you have riots and an ideology of a non-lethal, it being a non-lethal revolt. In fact, the word Intifada was initially chosen because it had less
no
militant connotations. It didn't sound as violent. And so you have the First Intifada, where basically people boycott workers, people burn their IDs that are issued by Israel. They boycott, they go on strike, they refuse to work, and then they basically throw rocks and effectively try to get the soldiers out of the West Bank. And you have this non-lethal protest movement that goes on for a while, and then basically the response that we got from the other side was so brutal. We lost more lives than
policy.
The Iron Fist policy, where protesters had their bones broken by soldiers, so they couldn't come back to protest the following day. We lost more lives in the First Intifada than we did in one of the Gaza wars. And the number of people who were maimed, and just the intensity and the brutality of the response, basically is what popularized the guerrilla warfare terror tactics. It was like, cool, so you can't face them in this way. So the hit and run approach so this is what fueled the tactic. And so other groups who basically said, this, what you're saying is never going to work, this like non-lethal protest movement, they became more popular as a result of the iron fist policy. It was seen as effectively a dead end. There's no other way you're going to be able to achieve any change without a different set of tactics. And that is, how it is perceived. So we hear you say that, okay, well, there are these terror attacks against civilians are innocent. And if we weren't worried about this, and this wouldn't be an issue, and that's what the concern is. And yet, like, when there are non-lethal protest movements, or even when there's activism, so political activists are still jailed. I have family members who have been jailed, been placed in indefinite, administrative detention for totally peaceful. I mean, not even protesting, like trying to place international pressure on the state, and they're treated the same way. So they treated with the same brutality. In a lot of ways, it's sort of safer to be part of one of these militant groups than it is to be a public, peace activist. Particularly, if you're part of, particularly if it seems like a credible movement. It's true. They're treated quite brutally. I mean, you can, there's so many of these cases, and so, I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, or do you feel that contributes to the cycle of violence?
I'm going to give my personal opinion now. I understand the need for Palestinians to fight for their rights. Even as an Israeli, I understand. I understand that I should expect no Palestinian to accept the occupation, to accept living, not even a second class. And we're talking especially, obviously, those in C, B, and A, yeah? Because in Israel, it's a different story. As third-class citizens, I can't expect a Palestinian to ever accept the fact that he can't go to visit his family in the neighboring village. Or if he does, it takes him 3 days. I don't expect it. I think Palestinians have the right to protest, and I understand that you guys are not able to protest. 1, because of the PA, and 2, because of Israel. And so your guys are hands tied. I understand also why you resolve to violence. I understand why you guys feel safer when you go to militant groups, because at least you're getting paid. Your family will be taken care of. You have a group of people who are actually looking out for you. And so that's when your mind gets effed a bit, when you understand. But I don't really want to get into that yet. I just, I can never be okay with Israelis, with the Israeli government detaining people and Palestinians who are trying to choose a peaceful route, okay, or a diplomatic route. I don't think, maybe I was very ignorant, but like I said, most of the Israelis I classify as uneducated. I don't know how many Jews know. I can tell you that I spoke to a lot of Israelis before this Q&A, and I asked them the same thing. Like, what would we tell a Palestinian? Like, why is it okay for them? Why should they choose a peaceful route if they're being detained? And they're like, they're being detained for what? And I was just like, well, this one wanted to go to the International Criminal Court, and this one wanted to do this, and this one wanted to do that. And they're like, why are they being detained? That's not a threat. That is them choosing peaceful action. And so I think it has largely to do with uneducation. And I think maybe I'm being positive. Maybe I want to see the best in my people. But I don't think that anyone would support peaceful activism, okay, or peaceful protests, and then being detained and then able to do that, or being, like in Israel. I don't know if you saw in the news how Israelis are protesting against Bibi's house, and the violence on the police end. People were like shook, right? It's just a protest. No one's hitting anyone. It's not violent. No one's looting. Why are you attacking the protesters. And so I really don't think that most Israelis would condone that action if they knew. And so this is our part. So the part of the responsibility of the Palestinians and the Jews, the Israelis, when they hear about these things, is to put light to it. You know what I mean? So me as an Israeli goes like, hey, our biggest critique is that they've chosen violence as a tactic to go against the oppression and the occupation, both from the PA and from Israel or Hamas or whatever. This is a person who is doing the right thing. I mean, we might disagree with her. We might not want her to win the criminal court case. But what she's doing, what she's demonstrating, is that there can be a peaceful intifada. I mean, intifada is struggle. Struggle isn't inherently violent. It could be diplomatic, it could be political, it could be cultural, it could be intellectual. And so once we know that Israelis, we need to bring it to Israeli, knowledge, going like, hey, this is going on. And we need to put pressure on the state that these people should not be detained for however long. It's not okay. You won't see me justifying it. I won't try to justify it. There's no way for me to spin it into a narrative that is okay. It's not. And I really hope that Palestinians would bring it to Israelis' knowledge. Hey, this is going on. So the Israelis who care, like me, will put it to the attention of other Israelis. And hopefully we could tell the government this is not okay.
I think on the subject of violence, this is sort of where you get this like perspective difference where Palestinians are condemned for the use of violence, but ultimately, we are subjected to violence. It's not like one party has disavowed the use of violence while the other still uses it. In fact, I mean, the West Bank, at least the PA, brutally cracks down on resistance groups, which people aren't happy about. Because there's a sense that basically, Palestinians are terrorists when they use violence to achieve political aims, but when the IDF bombs Gaza or soldiers basically use crowd control protests with either rubber bullets that are sort of like semi-lethal or eventually live ammunition. That's okay. So one side, who has the resources, and I mean, you can say that you make every attempt not to kill civilians, but ultimately, regardless of whether I agree with that, ultimately, civilians die, and civilians are a huge portion of the deaths. In the Gaza wars, the first and second intifadas, and the conflict at large, and so there's this sense that one side is using violence to control us. And if people try to resist violent occupation with violence, and they're condemned as terrorists. While Israel is just protecting ourselves. You guys are just looking after your own security, but we are somehow aggressors.
So it really, in like a sentence, we just see ourselves as responding, and you guys are initiating. So Palestinians initiate an attack, and then Israel responds. That's how almost every Israeli sees it. That's one. Two, I know that innocent civilians are being killed. And I really don't know if the government or the IDF is purposely, not purposely. I don't think it's purposely. They're saying it's not purposely. They're saying it's collateral damage. And we believe it. We believe that it's collateral damage because, when if a terrorist goes out and do it, so one targets civilians and the other one doesn't target civilians. They target the person who perpetrated these attacks or who are about to perpetrate these attacks. But these people are hiding in buildings and in homes and in wherever, public places. And so, Israelis are faced with a moral dilemma. This place is populated. What do we do? But if it's a ticking time bomb, we're just like, we need to do what we need to do. And it sucks. But it's seen as a necessity. There's also a huge thing, and this is kind of like where the media gets us. So we've become desensitized to Palestinian suffering because there has been a lot of fake news regarding what's going on in Palestine. So, for example, during the Gaza war in 2014, there were pictures that were published in newspapers saying that this is what Israelis were doing to Palestinian children, when the picture taken was a picture from the Syrian civil war.
Do you not see that as like noise?
And then
I mean,
it is, but you have to understand, when you're just like, okay, if the Palestinians are really suffering and are subjugated to so much violence as they claim, why the need for fake news? Why the need to dress up as an IDF soldier who's going to hit Palestinians? And you're just like, yo, that's not an IDF soldier. His beret doesn't even match his tag, and it doesn't match the zeh, and this unit doesn't go with this gun, it goes with this gun. Like you and any Israeli could tell that this was fake. It was set up. And so if it really happens, why?
I think, I think this sort of Palestinians feel that we are sort of we have to be held accountable for what every single Palestinian does, while Israelis don't have to be held accountable for what your government does at large.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, we can't control every propaganda story, or every whether that was deliberate, like whether the guy put that story together knowing it was false. So it sounds like in that case. So whether like some journalist just doesn't do their research and they publish fake news. I can give just as many examples of that happening on the Israeli side. I think that's sort of tangential. Like, and to me, it seems like an attempt to poison the water. So as long as you can kind of like cast doubt on something, then you can always have this sort of little voice in the back of your head saying, "Oh, maybe none of it's true, anyways." And I think I think that in of itself is a propaganda tactic. Like you are basically just going, well, we have no way of ever really knowing what's happening because there was this one, we read this one article that was false, and so.
No, legamre. I agree with you. It desensitizes Israelis and kind of makes them skeptical of what they read. If anyone cared enough to really do the research, anyone can see that a lot of innocent Palestinians have paid a heavy price. Even if you and I are to disagree on what, one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist, okay? So even if we were to disagree on the term, I think we could both agree that a majority of the Palestinians just want to live a normal life, and they're not concocting any plan to blow up, a bus full of children or whatever. They just want to live. They want to breathe. They want to see their family. And when you do the homework, and that's also why I said it's such a process, and it's a very emotional process. It's difficult. It's difficult to see the price that Palestinians are paying for the livelihood of Israel. It's not easy. It's looking at our ugliest and darkest sides. And I think that as an individual, people want to be blind to, their flaws and their bad qualities, and they want to focus on the good. And I think it's the same thing on a nation state level. And to see it, I can't, as an individual, as a humanitarian, not even as an Israeli, okay? I can't justify seeing all those innocent people killed. I can tell you like a great sentence, you know, in Gaza war, we sent 4,000 missiles and yet only 1,000 people were killed. So it's just like, you know, for every one person dead, it was 4 missiles. So look at how, you know, we were very moral in our wage of war. But as an individual, I can't say that. I can't say that. They're kids and they're the wives and their siblings. And, you know, can we fight differently that wouldn't cause so much collateral damage? I don't know. I really don't. But that's just why I want to stop the fighting, because at the end of the day, they're just two sides, innocent civilians who are having their lives lost and taken away from them. And it's just, Dani, I can't accept that.
So on this, how people feel about violence and the desire, you sort of become aware of these stories, and then you go for, you know, the fighting needs to stop. So, you know, Israelis will see the stories of stabbings or attacks on civilians, and you know, basically like regular people dying. And from the Second Intifada onwards, there is a clear shift to the right in Israeli politics.
The left is dead.
And I guess, you know, on the Palestinian side, the Gaza war, you have a new generation that's born every time. And there's sort of significant events that happen that they see that shift them to sort of the equivalent of further right. And so, you know, in Gaza, we saw homes demolished on top of people buried alive, white phosphorus burns and faces of children that they'll carry with them for the rest of their life. And I guess we are exposed to that imagery, just as you are exposed to that imagery. So that has an impact on our politics. Do you think these wars had an impact on your politics?
Yeah, of course. Because every time you want to talk about a solution, every time you want to talk on the behalf of the Palestinians, Israelis remember what they suffered at the hands of Palestinians. You know, my dad, when I talked to him about the Palestinians' right to self-determine, he won't forget that when he was 5 years old, he went to a bus and, you know, it blew up in front of his eyes. And when he went to my school to come at a Purim festival, you know, a street light blew up in front of him, and that he won't forget that I had to walk around with a mask, you know, to keep my identity, and also because they were scared of the usage of chemical weapons. And when you talk to Israelis about one day bringing down the checkpoints and bringing down the walls, you know, they're just like, but that's what protects me from the Palestinians. You know, that I remember I wasn't here in the Second Intifada, so I don't know. But people who were here are so terrified. They're so terrified. Now, you ask Dani, the individual, and we put down the wall and we came to the Palestinians and we're sincere in saying we need to find a solution, one that would make you equal, okay? Whether it's 2 states, 67 borders, or a federation, or a 1 state, but like legit with a plan and sincerity, I think most of the violence would be gone the next day. However, there are those group of people who are violent and want to stay in power, and they won't let go so easily. And I think the question that a lot of Israelis are faced with is, would Palestinians go against these groups if met with peace, like on the Israeli end? I think that's
historically, yes.
Rattles us.
Historically, yes. And I think that whether it's the history of Abu Ammar and negotiating, our ability to be able to control our own, you know, militant groups is sort of usually the premise of the peace deals. And it actually sort of leads me to my next question, which is the Israel-Palestine conflict has largely become a footnote inside of Israeli politics. So if I look at Israeli political parties today and the you know, the rhetoric, with very few exceptions, I mean, there's like the Arab list and whatnot. Meretz, and as you said, sort of the left is largely dead. People talk about security, but there is no political will to actually resolve the conflict. The intifadas are in the past. It seems to Palestinians that basically we almost have nothing to offer you. In the past, people had the ability to say that, give us peace and violence will end. And now, while there are still attacks, they are a minority of cases and tend to be, few and far in between. Certainly nothing like the second to further. Tend to be more lone wolf type attacks. How can Palestinians make the conflict relevant again to Israelis, given that it impacts their lives significantly less?
I think it would, from both sides, we need to bridge the media gap. We don't know what's going on in Palestine, in Palestinian territories. We don't know of your struggles. And I think it's the duty of Israeli civilians who are aware to spread that knowledge. And it's the duty of, it's unfortunately also the duty of the Palestinians to make that knowledge accessible. So I read a bit of Arabic, and so I'm able to look at stuff on Google, but most Israelis don't know that well Arabic. And so a lot of the news that's going on in Palestine, or for example, you and I have spoken about the fact that leaderships and people have actually gone against people, Palestinian people who chose violence, because they also understand that this is the Israeli narrative. And they're like, we want to stop doing this because they're going to hit us, and they're going to hit us hard, and we just want peace. And for whatever reason you're stopping it, okay? Whether for pragmatic, whatever reasons. We are unaware of it. We don't see this. These are largely in Arabic. So if Palestinians could internationalize their media so it could be accessible to Israelis, for example, I could promise you that it would be my mission as someone who is, knowledgeable and wants to share this information and wants to debunk all these radical myths about Palestinians at large. I would do that. And I would hope that there are other Israelis that would do that. Yes, I would be called a traitor. And believe me, probably someone's going to see this video and they're going to call me a traitor. It's like, what am I going to do? You know what I mean? Like, I want to fight the right fight and the good fight. And me loving my country and me understanding that there are people who are just, that's not for me a traitor. That's just doing what's right. And, thankfully, we are living in an era of liberalism, and it's becoming more and more popular. And I think that could work. I also think that we could, try to look for more pragmatic reasons, right? So why is the status quo unsustainable? Okay, how would it benefit Israelis to find a solution for the Palestinians if we're not even looking at this whole, debunking and media gaps? We would just look at pragmatic reasons. So Israel's economy would strengthen. One, because we would not be spending so much money on security for the occupation and controlling and, the Palestinian people. That's one. That's already so much money. Instead of putting it there, we can put it into something else. Okay? So it's not that we're necessarily making more money. We're just now able to use the money that we already have better. So yeah, and I think it's to try to converse. So media gaps, conversations, and if we are looking at more pragmatic, just explaining to Israelis why they would benefit, why the status quo isn't sustainable. I haven't been so successful in convincing other Israelis that the status quo isn't sustainable, but there are Israelis who are very successful in explaining it.
That was basically my next question, which is that do Israelis see the status quo? You've sort of hit the nail on the head, which is like basically, do Israelis feel the status quo is unsustainable?
Yes and no.
I mean, to me, it seems like you have a bunch of gasoline that's just waiting for a match, and the whole thing's going to explode, and it has over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And humans have this tendency to think that we forget really, really fast. So even like the silent intifada in 2014, but even the second intifada wasn't that long ago, and the fact that there has been relative quiet or relative peace, partially because of the tactics the PA have tried to go for in the last 14 years, which is something like international pressure, and then you have Israel sort of forming all these normalization deals with the Arab states, and so largely it's clear that that era is dead. And to me, it seems inevitable that as soon as one of the dominoes fall, the whole thing's going to come unraveled. And so to us, it seems like the status quo can't continue, and that it's going to fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly now. I mean, it is well and truly the whole premise of what the PA was trying to do, or the tactic that they took, and the Fatah leadership, was this international pressure. We're going to try to get 67 borders, East Jerusalem, sort of thing. We're going to do it through international pressure and sort of the UN observer status and a number of steps that they took in the last 14 years. And in order to be able to do that and basically be left alone to do that, we are going to try to really brutally stop any militias or any resistance from happening in Palestine for the duration of this process, because that'll kind of, their view was that it would impede that. And they sort of went through this process, and it seems like it's over. At least to most Palestinians, it seems like this process is well and truly dead. I think the idea the international community is going to play a role in the short term in any of this, particularly with what's happened in the last 4 years with sort of normalization in Arab states, seems to be over. And so presently, to Palestinians, it feels like we are on the cusp of a new phase. We just don't know what this new phase is going to be. But we feel inevitably the status quo is unsustainable. Inevitably, the unemployment rates are too high. The people are too hopeless. And the whole thing just, seems like you've got a bunch of gasoline that's ready to explode at any minute. So do Israelis recognize, I guess, the threat, or why that's such a bad outcome, if this stalemate breaks at any point, or do they just sort of live too far away from conflict to see it as a reality?
There are who live too far away to see it as a reality. Like I said, the ambivalent, the uneducated, they're just like, it is what it is, Then you have those who think that the status quo is sustainable because of Israel's, power dynamic. We are much stronger than you are. Even if you guys want to do something, and I quote hesitantly, sorry, we could eliminate you guys in a second. You know what I mean? So even if shit's about to go down, they're just like, Israel has the upper hand. It's really not that big of an issue. A lot of Israelis do believe that the status quo is not sustainable. And they think that now that there is relative quietness, I wouldn't say peace, because very little Israelis would dictate these last 15 years as peaceful. But let's just say relatively quiet. So we have the luxury and the privilege now to take the steps needed. So now, upcoming elections, you start hearing politicians talking about it. And even if they're like really right-wing positions or left-wing, they're talking about it. And like, it's a big deal. So people are aware that the status quo is not sustainable. Definitely the government, which is why they're talking about it, whether we agree with their proposals on how to handle it and what the solution might be. But But yeah, so, and those who believe that, it is sustainable, not just the upper hand, but it's also because of normalization with the Arab states. So we are as in the people in Israel of this sector are hoping that the more we normalize with Arab states, the less legitimacy you guys have, the easier it will be to maintain that status quo.
I guess a final question then is if you were, if the situations were reversed, and that it was Palestinians who were returning to the land in the 1900s, and went through this process of first pragmatic Zionism, and then a conflict with nearby states, and the Nakba and the military occupation today. That is to say, if you yourself were Palestinian, what would you do in our position? How would you feel about the conflict? What do you think your response would be?
So I'd like to answer the question, if I may, by stories that I've heard and seen from Palestinians and the sources they've sent me. So, we talk about how Palestinians were born and raised to hate and kill Jews. And then I talked to a Palestinian person who told me about his experience and his contact with Israel, tried to explain to me why no one had to teach him anything for him to feel what he felt. And his first memories of contact with Israel was when his cousin was shot dead, and he was a very young kid. In 4th grade, his mother was shot. She didn't do anything at all. She was collateral damage. But who sees, what 4th grader sees their mom as collateral damage and say, it's fine, my mom was shot by these people, and I'm okay with them. Now, thank God that the mother did not die, okay? But there are several Palestinians who've had their father killed, their mother killed, their brother killed, their sister killed, whatever, you name it, okay? And those who weren't proper Hamas or proper terrorists, they were collateral damage. I saw a documentary, thanks to you, on the children in Gaza. And there was this one kid in particular, I had his name down, and I don't remember, but he tells a story about how he and his family were hiding in the house, and an Israel soldier knocked on the door. Told him to leave. And the father came, and I'm sorry, but this was what he showed, with his hands up very closely to the door, and said, yes, how can I help you? And he was shot down dead. And this kid was like 8 years old, and he said, I wasn't born to hate. I didn't even know what hate was. But my father was shot right in front of me. And then my brother was killed right in front of me. And so I hate. I would hate the killer of my father. I don't know if I could forgive and find the compassion to forgive them, to understand their narrative and accept the fact that my father, my mother, was collateral damage. I would never accept that. I would never, and then you see a video of this old man. He wanted to go from checkpoint to checkpoint. And I don't even remember what he wanted to do, go visit his family or something, but the IDF didn't let him cross. And this is an old man. Like, honestly, if I'd see him on the street, I would go like, oh, you're so cute, okay? The last thing he looked like was a threat. And they didn't allow him to pass through. I guess his permit wasn't valid. I don't remember what it was. And he came to the IDF soldier and he said, look me in the eyes. Look me in the eyes, like, I'm not a threat to you. I just want to pass. I just want to walk freely. Why won't you let me? And the soldier doesn't do anything to the man. He's just like, sorry, I'm following orders. You need to go back. So it's not that the soldier was evil, okay? But you see this man, just a very innocent old man, crying to the soldier and saying, please, please allow me some dignity. Allow me some dignity and just pass, you know? Look at my pockets. And he started emptying it. And he started, you know, throwing his jacket, and he was like, I have nothing. I have nothing to threaten you. So I don't know. The only thing I can say is that I was also, I was never ripped of my dignity. I was never living under occupation and oppression, but I do know what it's like to live under fear. I do know what it's like to live with hate. And I came to the conclusion that hate will get me nowhere. It will only continue the cycle of violence, and more innocent people will be killed because of it. And so no matter how much the hate is justified, we need to break the cycle of violence. It is the only way that we can strive for a different tomorrow. And the Palestinian who witnessed his mother getting shot was also met at a junction in his life. Two roads diverge in a yellow woods, and he had to choose between resistance or violent resistance, or resistance in a cultural and intellectual way with reaching out to Israelis. I can tell you that this Palestinian changed me. When I saw that he was met with this obstacle and he chose to converse with me, he chose to educate me, he chose to speak with the people who shot his mother instead of fight them, I said, if he can do it, anyone can do it. And it made me appreciate the Palestinian struggle in a different way, and the Palestinian people in a different way. And this is why I think that it's important that we give Palestinians a platform to talk about their narrative, to give this intellectual intifada, this cultural thing, to educate us. It is our moral obligation. It's not even a moral obligation, but it's our obligation to learn, because they could have chosen differently and they chose not to. And I personally don't take it for granted. I appreciate it.
Very well said. Adar, if you're with us, that's the final question.
That was amazing, both of you. Dani, Abu Zahir, super inspiring. What we're going to do is I think we'll take 2 community questions, then we'll move it to the after party in Discord. Whoever's not in our Discord yet, I'm dropping a link in the comments. I won't explain too much about Discord, but it just happens to be the coolest community you'll ever come across. And we have dialogue sessions. We're going to continue this conversation, but anyone else can chime in and ask questions and share their thoughts. And before we get to the questions, I actually want to bring to light where this idea of 20 questions came from. Zahir and Dani approached me and said they want to do 20 questions. And here they are doing this. The Great Debate is not about me. It's about all of us. It's a community project. And the idea is for everyone to contribute to the goal of bringing people together towards common ground and aiding in the reconciliation process. If anybody wants to contribute, everyone is invited in. If you have an idea for a show and want to be here live, pitch it to me. You can find my contact information in the description, and we'll talk about it. If it fits our vision, let's do it. You know, we consider ourselves a publisher that focuses on connecting people and reconciliating between people in conflict. Everybody is invited to be part of this important and inspiring project. Okay. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe. Questions. Yeah, we got one, Zahir. It's going to be for you. I know you may have responded to this, but it is a common talking point, you could say. Question for Palestinians. Would you really want to have a name as such? Palestinian is a Hebrew word which root is to invade. Would you really want to be called that?
Yeah, it's a weird thing. I've sort of heard this before. So the name has a very long history. It goes back to you sort of starts with Belisat around 1200 BC. So it sort of predates um, that history. And 12th dynasty, 20th dynasty of Egypt, and then the Assyrians start to refer to the region as Palashtu or Palastu or Pelestu. Palestine, as an actual term, is just Palestine around 5th century BC. In ancient Greek, the term is not Hebrew in origins. This is sort of similar to like how the Canaanites are referred to as invaders inside of religious texts, when sort of anthropologically most historians believe that the Hebrew Jewish people emerged out of the Canaanites and then fought them. And so in the text it says they're the enemy, uh, um, but the history was sort of that they emerged out of them and then warred with them. What the etymology of the term in Hebrew is unclear to me, but the term itself comes from sort of hieroglyphics. And, like, that's the first time you get these letters, and the Greeks sort of hear the term and refer to it. Um, Part of the reason people have issues with the term is also the view that the name was that when after the Bar Kokhba revolt, there is like a certain, some evidence that, or some people claim that the name was changed to back to Syria Palestina by the Romans to sever the connection of Jews to the land. Regardless, though, it is just a name for the region. So Palestine to us is the name of the land itself, and then we are the people of the land. So it's not about linking it to the name of the Roman province, or like people link it to like the Philistines or the Sea Peoples or the invaders. A lot of these words are similar, and maybe like language in general emerge out of each other. But for Palestinians, it's just one of the older names for the region. I mean, indeed, Jews refer to the land as Palestine for a lot of their history. As far as the names and how we identified with them, I mean, you can call the land Israel, but that seems specifically Jewish. It comes from God rules. So Palestine is for us, the most neutral name for the land, and then we refer as Palestinian to all the occupants of the land, basically prior to sort of like first, second Aliyah. So it doesn't come from the Philistines or from Syria, Palestina. It is just a very old name that's been in the region since 20th dynasty Egypt.
Yeah, let me build on that. I mean, Marto, I brought up your question, but as Zahir was answering, you just kept writing things as if you weren't even listening to him. He explained that it doesn't have Hebrew origin, and the word invader, that's not the original meaning. It came from Philistines. Philistines were then called invaders, but the term Philistine is a term that is not Hebrew and did not mean invader. So, bro, if you're going to ask a question and we're going to take time to answer, at least listen. And just to build on that, even if it meant the worst thing, right? It had a horrible origin. Words and meanings change. So a Palestinian who his entire life has known that his nation is Palestine and has immense pride in Palestine, you can't expect them to just want to change that because it has some meaning that you don't like. Like, bro, that's not how like national identity and pride works. You wouldn't expect that of ourselves. If we were to discover something we had deep meaning, had some that the meaning had some bad initial definition, that wouldn't change the way we felt about it, because words change. And that being said, it's quite irrelevant because, as we've explained, it's not a Hebrew word. Cool. Any other questions? No, I think. No. All right, we're gonna move this to the after party. This was fun. The after party can continue for many hours. It's really up to the people, but it's great to see you. Great to see you all. Tomorrow we have a debate with Ariel Gold and Malka Fleischer. That one's going to be fireworks. The week after that, we have Yishai Fleischer and Malkon Mazarian, who is a East Jerusalemite Palestinian. And beginning of February, we have Rudy Rachman and Noam Chomsky. Sorry, Rudy Rushman and Noam Chomsky. Anyways, this was great pleasure. Join us in the Discord if you want to catch us. Love you all.